Well, first of all, I have to tell you there have been some changes that have taken place. The two major ones are originally we were planning for me to do an hour, and I always have found that conversations are more important than lectures and more interesting. So I wanted to save at least 15 minutes of that hour for Q&A. But now that it's 45 minutes instead of an hour, I think in order to deal with the issues that I think are important to all of us, I won't be able to leave 15 minutes, but I'm hoping at least 5 minutes for some Q&A. And I want to begin, first of all, by recognizing or to let you know that the kind of conversation among farmers that we had yesterday in this group, I thought was truly revolutionary. And the reason that I believe that is because I think that when farmers engage each other, especially the way you did, in terms of honestly sharing what you're actually experiencing on your own farms, that's much more important than any kind of lecture that I would give. And the reason that it is much more important is because when farmers engage each other the way they do, then it's really revolutionary because it's contrary to the kind of corporatization that has been dominating our food and agriculture system for, at least 30 or 40 years. So you are really charting a path for the future that's different, and that's so important because it's going to be the conversations that we have with each other and what we learn from each other when we're honest with each other and share our actual information, which is going to chart the course for the future. So I want to thank you for your willingness to do that and demonstrating that it can be done. So let me first of all begin by indicating that I think that, and I gave this a lot of thought in terms of what might be most useful to our thinking here in terms of a quote-unquote keynote. And I think that, one of the other things I wanted to mention too, I was planning in my talk to include some fairly important issues around soil health and the microbiology in the soil. And since Adra has already done that this morning, I'm going to touch on this a little bit and add a couple things to it, but she did a great job of helping us understand how important life in the soil is to everything that we all are dedicated to and want to accomplish. Now, I think that one of the things that to me is concerning, and I'm, as you know, I'm not only still engaged in my farm in North Dakota, but primarily involved in academic institutions like the Leopold Center at Iowa State University, and then also involved with the Stone Barn Center for Food and Agriculture out in New York. And the thing that I've discovered primarily in our educational institutions is that, and I don't mean this in any critical way, simply as an observation of where we need to go and what we can do together, and especially for organizations and groups like this. And that is that, we still, let me just speak about Iowa State University, where the Leopold Center is located and where I spend half of my time, that the emphasis is still on STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, and math. And that's what, when students come to the university, that's what, especially involved in agriculture, that's what they're told is the future, and this is what they have to do. And what does that really tell us? If it's science, technology, engineering, and math, it's really telling us that the general larger picture is fine, we just have to get a little better at it. Better technology, better science, better engineering, better math. Now, the interesting thing to me, as the new generation of students now are coming in, they kind of buy into that at the beginning when they first come there. But within a matter of months, they begin to recognize that this is their future that we're talking about, and that simply doing a little better job with what we've been doing is not the challenges that they're going to be facing. And to me, that's very hopeful. So that begins to change the quality of our education, the concern of our education, and what we need to be facing in the future. And I think one of the other problems that we're facing is that we still, in the larger culture of things, we're still operating under the notion of something that actually, from my point of view, Lewis Mumford pointed out in his book, The Golden Day, A Study in American Experience and Culture, which was actually published back in 1926. And one of the things that Lewis Mumford pointed out is that we have developed a culture, already he understood this in 1926, that matter alone matters. That is really about the physical relationships. There isn't anything about imagination or inspiration or those other kinds of things. It's simply matter alone matters. And then, of course, in our food and agriculture, if matter alone matters, what do we put the emphasis on? It's yield. It's all those kinds of physical sorts of things that really matters. And I'm not saying that as a farmer, I certainly understand the importance of yield. But if yields are the only thing that drives us, then a lot of the things we've heard already here at this conference simply don't matter, right? Because it's only the matter that matters, only the physical kinds of things. And so this then creates a kind of materialistic culture which takes off the table some of the important things that I want to share with you this morning that I think are important. And so, and it also then means that if matter alone matters, then our sense of hopefulness is also connected with that. Our hopefulness gets satisfied if we really increase the matter. It doesn't have anything to do with imagination or all these other kinds of more spiritual sort of things. And I know spiritual is not a term that probably most of us in our culture are very attracted to, but I want to talk about that a little bit in a bit here. But the other thing is that it has led us to is a kind of extractive economics. You know, we're successful if we can grab as much out of the economics for ourselves. It's all about mine and now. So we lose the sense of the commonality and how we work together in a community and realize the importance and the value of those kinds of things. It's all about mine and now. And so now, of course, while all of this has developed in our culture, we have, of course, had some luminaries that have already pointed out to us some time ago that this is not the future. This is not how we ought to be focusing our time and our energy. So we've had people like Václav Havel and Wendell Berry and Martin Luther King Jr., who have all had a different perspective about this and brought some visionary and inspiring ways for us to think about this. And that is that hope and hopefulness is not about how much we extract from our economy, but it is our commitment to justice. And it's when we do that that we begin to really become involved in the actual experiences of life that make a difference. And many of those luminaries referred to this as difficult hope. But nevertheless, it's the important part of how we think about our future. Now, so I want to, the thing that I want to share with you now in terms of all of this is that we need to begin to question the value of matter alone matters in our culture and begin to look at an alternative approach. And one of the things that makes sense to me as we do that, there's really a threefold approach that makes sense. That's the ecological, the spiritual, and the social. Now, I'm the first one to recognize that probably doesn't make a lot of sense in our culture to talk about it in those terms. But let me explain a little bit why those three proponents, I think, are of value as opposed to matter alone mattering. The ecological, from my point of view, was articulated so clearly by Aldo Leopold when he said, among many other things, that we are not the conquerors of the land community. And by land community, he meant this total interdependent community of life. And we are not the conquerors of that. And agriculture, of course, is part of that interdependent community of life. We are not the conquerors. We are, as he said, simply plain members and citizens. So we are a part of that interdependent community of life. And the real challenge for us is to see how we fit in, how we can add to the value of that interdependent community of life. And so that's the ecological component. The spiritual component is probably more difficult because spirituality in our culture is kind of like, well, it's for some weird religious people. But I want to call attention, and I brought my copy of this because it just came out a couple of months ago, a new book by Stephen McFadden entitled Deep Agroecology. And he points out in here how important the spiritual dimension is, and that's what the whole book is about. It's about this, how we begin to really think about agriculture when we think about it from a spiritual perspective. And let me just give you a brief quote in the introduction to the book. He said, "Farming as a corporate industrial profit-driven business, ? That's the matter alone matters approach. Or is farming a way of life in harmony with nature, serving as a clean, healthy, just, and egalitarian foundation for the high-tech digital culture of the present and future, and for the necessary spiritual evolution of humanity?" Now think about that for a minute. If we were to think about food and agriculture from that kind of spiritual dimension, along with the ecological dimension, how would we begin to see ourselves in relationship to food and agriculture in our own farming communities? And then the third component is the social. And again, in our culture, we have been developing, again, this sense of mine and now, so it's all about the individual. So we don't even, in many of our, and I'm sure you all know this as I do, that in many of our, even in our communities, we don't talk to our neighbors anymore. They're doing their thing over there and we're doing our thing here. And so there's this sense that the kind of community situation is simply not important. And here's again where there's a great resource if you haven't had a chance to look at Bob Quinn's new book, Grain by Grain, in which he says one of the things that we need to do now is to think about community rather than commodities. Again, think about that shift. If we were to think about our agriculture activities in terms of community, in terms of how we relate to others who are also involved in producing our food, that I think would be a major. So the ecological, the spiritual, and the social, I think, is a new kind of framework that we can begin to think together as we think about the future. Now, there are a number of resources, and I don't know how many of you like to do reading. I don't like to do it all the time, but I get inspired by some of the things that I've read. And so I want to call attention to a couple of these. There's about 6 or 7 I got on the list here, but we're not going to have time to go through all of them. But one of these resources that I have personally found really helpful as we think about all of these things, and that's Jared Diamond's work. How many of you know about Jared Diamond's work? Okay, number of hands go up, great. And Jared Diamond published several books, but 2 particularly that were inspiring for me is the earlier one that he wrote, Guns, Germs, and Steel, The Fates of Human Societies. And then the second one, which just came out 2 years ago, called Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fail or Succeed. And one of the things that Jared Diamond discovered based on his study of past civilizations, he discovered that those civilizations that anticipated changes coming at them and prepared for them in advance were the ones that tended to thrive. Those that failed in that exercise were the ones that tended to collapse. And when I read that, I thought, wow, you know, why aren't we, in the terms of our own society today, as we think about the future, why aren't we thinking about it in those terms? Anticipating changes and preparing for them in advance. And when he uses the term anticipating changes, he makes it very clear he's not talking about predicting the future, because we're not very good at that, because we tend to predict the future based on current circumstances, and then of course things change, and then the predictions become irrelevant. But when you think about anticipating changes, what you're really doing is saying, well, there are some things that could happen. And I want to mention at least two of them this morning that I think are really important for us. But they're things that could happen, and that doesn't mean that you're predicting that they will happen, but since they could happen, you want to prepare for them in case they do happen. And then we are likely to be a society that thrives rather than a society that collapses. Now, if you think about anticipating changes, the two that I think are perhaps most important for us today that we have to all really take into consideration. And one of those is climate change. Now, we've had several people had mentioned that in this conference here. But, you know, the most recent IPCC report indicates that we only have about 10 years now to really deal with climate change, you know, anticipate those changes and prepare for them in advance. And if we don't do it within that 10-year period, then the effects of climate change are going to become, quote, catastrophic. Now, certainly every farmer in the room, and I've already heard several of you mention this in terms of your own farming operations, you're already beginning to experience climate change. And we certainly have on our farm. Our cropping system this past year has been the worst since I've been involved in farming. Why? Because in North Dakota, of course, where my farm is, the growing season is relatively short. So you have to make sure you get your planting done on time so that your crops can get ready for harvest by the time the fall weather starts to come in. And so we always want to plant our cool season crops like flax and wheat by the second week in April. And then it has the time to get, you know, to harvesting time before the fall weather starts to come in. Well, this year, in the second week of April, we had 8 inches of snow in North Dakota. So our farmers couldn't get into the field until the second week in May when they planted the cool season crops, and then, of course, after that. And then in the second week of September, we had 10 inches of snow before the flax was even ready for harvesting. So huge losses. And then in addition to that, we had more rain than I've ever seen during the summer period of time. And that in turn, not only for our farm, but as far as I know, all the farmers in North Dakota, caused serious problems with vomitoxin in wheat, which made it unsaleable. Now our farmers expended the money to have the wheat cleaned to see if they could clean it to a point, and the company that did that thought there was a possibility. They're still wrestling with trying to find out whether or not it's even saleable for them now. So right now they have 15,000 bushels of wheat in our wheat bin, not able to sell it yet as of today. Hopefully that will change in the next couple of weeks, but we don't know. And then if they can't sell it, they're going to have 15,000 bushels of wheat in the bin they don't know what to do with. You can't feed it to animals either. And then what are they going to do if hopefully we do have a decent wheat crop in 2020? Where are we going to put it? So these are the kinds of issues that the climate change issue in terms of the effects on farmers are having on us. And like I say, it's not just our farms, so there's others as well. The second big issue I think that we need to think about in terms of anticipating changes is the fact that we are now in a kind of agriculture that we've been in for basically a century. A little bit of the history here. You go back to 1840 is when Justus von Liebig applied the law of the minimum to agriculture. And applying the law of the minimum for him was, he was the one who came up with the idea of NPK. If you just put nitrogen, phosphorus, and potash into the soil, then you can get this huge response from that minimum input. And that's the future of agriculture. And of course, it became quite attractive, even though farmers had to make big changes from managing for soil health to managing in terms of this law of the minimum. But they also began to recognize that, there was some, and my father struggled with this, was this a direction he should take or not? And it wasn't until after the Second World War when the munitions factories, who had been making all of their money by creating the munitions, and when the war was over, what were they going to do? And then they began to discover that they could manufacture fertilizer and sell fertilizers on a cheap basis to farmers and get their income. And that's exactly what they did, and that's when my father bought into that approach to agriculture. But we're at a point now where this kind of using these inputs is increasingly becoming expensive. Why? Because all of those inputs, as Ernest Shusky pointed out, are non-renewable inputs. And so as we use them up, the costs are going to go up, and eventually they're not going to be available. And if you simply look at two of those from the point of view, rock phosphate from which we get our phosphorus, we only have 4 countries who still have rock phosphate reserves. And at the rate that we're using them up, the experts who've been looking at this are telling us that rock phosphate will only continue to be available for another 20 years at most, and maybe only another 10 years. And of course, if rock phosphate keeps being depleted over the next 10 years, those costs will, as they already have. Back in the 1960s, farmers were buying phosphorus for $60 a ton. Now it's $700 a ton. So it's not unreasonable to expect that sometime over the next 10 years, there'll be $2,500 a ton. So at what point does that input-intensive system, and I'm not just talking about conventional agriculture, and we've had some of this conversation here at this conference, that in organic agriculture, there's also that choice between input-intensive, you simply use natural inputs instead of synthetic inputs, but they're also non-renewable. And so at some point, we're going to use them up. So what are we going to do? What's the future of agriculture looking like? Well, here is where I think is the important thing about soil health and the kinds of things that Abra pointed out to us this morning about how the microbes in the soil are the foundation of the future of a self-renewing kind of agriculture. And this isn't brand new. There are already farmers who have been doing this. In Iowa, for example, Ron Roseman, who farms near Harlan, Iowa, and some of you probably know him. But when he took over his father's farm back in the 1970s, it was a typical corn soybean farm with all of the inputs. And then he began to realize somehow that this was not the kind of agriculture that he wanted to support. So he started to diversify his system, included animals, diversified. I think he does 6 or 7 different crops now that he does. And he has now not purchased any nitrogen since 1980, and only very small amounts of phosphorus once every 5 years. So by eliminating that amount of input that he had to buy, that he doesn't do anymore, he's actually making a profit. And his children now are recognizing that the kind of food that they're producing using this kind of self-renewing system is excellent food, so they've started a retail program to sell the food directly to people in their community. Now, I'm not saying that everybody can do exactly that, but there are alternatives that are already being used out there. So this sense about anticipating changes, I think, and getting a head start preparing for them is an important kind of lesson that we need to include in our future. Now, there are a number of other resources that I could mention to you, and I want to save a little time for us to have some Q&A. But there's another book which also came out this past year in 2019 by Timothy Weiss. And the title of the book is Eating Tomorrow, Agribusiness, Family Farmers, and the Battle for the Future of Food. And what Timothy Weiss points out, based on his travels around the world, is that we are now experiencing a transition which has already begun in many, many parts of the world, where the kinds of transitions that I've been indicating here are already taking place. And that about 70% of the people in developing countries already are doing small-scale farms with these kinds of self-renewing, and again, soil health being the foundation of that. So it's based on, as he says, rebuilding soils, nourishing a diversity of nature crops without external inputs, and healthy soil produces healthier food. Now that last point, healthier soil produces healthier food, I know there's still a lot of concerns about that. But we are just, again, and this is why, I mean, all of these things that I'm saying are not something that we can say, wow, this is already happening. These are early beginnings that I think are going to be increasingly a part of the future. And this connection between soil health and human health is already beginning, not by many, but by a few healthcare professionals. Daphne Miller, for example, who runs a clinic in California and teaches family medicine at the University of California, she's written a book entitled Pharmacology, spelled F-A-R-M, not P-H-A-R-M, as you might expect from a healthcare professional. And the reason she writes this book about pharmacology is because she's discovered as a healthcare professional that when she puts her patients on whole food produced on healthy soil, they actually become healthy. And it's not like when she gives them pharmaceuticals, which keeps them from getting worse, but it doesn't make them healthy. And then Maestra T. Klein, who runs a clinic in the Bronx in New York, she's written a book called The Dirt Cure, which she's experiencing the same thing. When she puts, and she primarily is a children's clinic, so she's primarily dealing with children. And generally, when parents find out that their children, which is increasingly true, unfortunately, in our society, where children become ill. And so she found out that when she put those children on some kind of pharmaceutical, it didn't make them healthy, it just kept them from getting worse. But when she put them on a whole diet of food produced on healthy soil, then they actually became healthy. And so now when parents have children who become ill, and they take them to their local clinic and they put them on some kind of pharmaceutical, and then they find out about Maestra T. Klein clinic, and so they take them to her clinic, and usually within a matter of weeks, the kids become healthy. Now, I'm not saying that this is solid science. This is based on experiments and experiences of individuals, and it's starting to happen in healthcare professionals as it is among farmers, as you have all shared your stories with each other. So I want to leave a little time for your questions in all of this, but this is basically the story that I wanted to share with you today, because I think we're talking about a major revolution here, and that revolution is going to happen simply because there is a need for it, and the old system, the input-intensive system that we've used now for a century isn't working anymore because we're depleting the natural resources necessary to make the input system work, and because we have these health issues and concerns, and also the fact that farmers are losing money. And here's another resource if you haven't looked at David Montgomery, who published a new book called Growing a Revolution. And the subtitle is that Bringing Soil Back to Life. And these are the stories of 8 farms that he has spent time on as a researcher. And what he discovered is that each of these 8 farms that he features in his book, they each had been input-intensive farms, and then they began to discover they were losing money. And then in their own way, they essentially did 3 things. They reduced their tillage, they included cover crops, which of course help restore the soil, and they significantly increased the biodiversity of their operations. And then they started to make a profit again. And so David Montgomery, as a result of this, became convinced as a researcher that it's restoring life of soil that's really the foundation of the future. Now again, this is not a big cultural shift yet, but I think it's the future that we're going in simply because the input-intensive system can't work anymore in the long-term future. So whatever we can do to make our systems self-renewing and self-regulating is a part of the future.